one thing that struck me in something that you said someplace is that you came to art through failing Greek.
That's right.
How many people can say that?
Probably not very many.
I don't think so. And you talked about this question of the importance, you might say, of negativity.
Yes.
The significance of negativity in life, I suppose, and art. Thinking that failing Greek is, in some sense, a negative, but there was a great positive that it produced. Now, would you like to explore a little bit for us the circumstances of that, how you came to making art through failing Greek?
Takes me back to high school, and in high school at the end of third year, we had a choice among a whole lot of disciplines. See if I can remember all of them. Woodwork, music, at one stage beekeeping, art, and Greek. And Greek came in as a sort of afterthought because we got having at the end of a succession of absolutely hopeless Latin teachers. Latin was required for everybody. And they used to say, if you passed Latin, you would pass everything. And happily I did. And the corollary to that was if you failed geography, you would fail everything. And happily I passed geography as well. But at the end of third year, you had this choice among those various disciplines. And because at that time I wanted to be a classics teacher, and in fact was doing okay in Latin, I opted for Greek, but found myself with a group of 4 people, one of whom ended up in the Cabinet Office in London. Another became head of Oriental languages at the University of Toronto, and the third, who was the brightest of all, I think he became a doctor. And there was me left trying to keep up with all these, and at the end of about 4 semesters, my math, which was my best subject at school, was good enough to work out what the trajectory was if I'd kept on with Greek, and it would have been pretty well underground by the time I'd finished. So I dropped Greek and turned to art instead, and found, and maybe with some sense of intellectual inferiority at the end of that episode, and found with relief that doing drawings and watercolour paintings wasn't entirely an intellectual activity, and that I could take refuge from things intellectual there. And it went on, and when the time came to choose where to go to university, then there were only 2 universities in England that offered studio art. I failed to get into Reading, so I went to Newcastle, where I was the student of mainly of Lawrence Gowing, who was the head of the department, though the 2 other people who stand out as luminaries were Victor Passmore and Richard Hamilton. And in hindsight, that seems to mean a very, very good mix of people to have worked with. And in the context of people who were devoted to studio art, though, then I found myself again getting nervous if I could keep up, and so devoted a lot of time to art history. And even if I couldn't claim to be the best artist in the group of artists, I did think I was holding my own very well in art history. And so at the end, Victor Passmore called me into his office, and I remember the words he used. He said, "We have decided that you ought to go to the Courtauld Institute." And
praise.
Not wanting to appear stupid, I didn't ask, what is the Courtauld Institute? I allowed it to emerge in due course, and eventually when I got there I realised that on a field trip previously I had been there. And so studied art history there for 2 years after my 4-year studio degree, and studied Renaissance art And then we had an option, several options, and also studied 19th century art. And that happily got me a job teaching at Leeds University, and constantly, well, even while I've been in Canada, I've been recommending to all sorts of students that the combination of art history and studio art is a very good one for getting jobs. And for my temperament, I think it's a good one for being an artist, although it also creates problems at the same time. That is, that art history is all about noticing things that the artist, well, it's not all about, but a lot of it is about. The connoisseurship aspect particularly is about noticing things that the artist wasn't aware of. I'm trying to remember what name Lermontiev went by. He was the person who, in the 19th century, in effect invented connoisseurship. And it was essentially that when you want to know, really see the hand, the personality of an artist, you don't look at the features of the face, you look at the way the ears are treated, the way the fingernails are treated, things that were secondary to the artist and normally unconscious to the artist. And so you're looking at things that make the unconscious conscious, and that provides a challenge as regards being an artist, the challenge of self-consciousness. And I remember after I'd finished my diploma at the Courtauld, I decided I was going to go back to being an artist. And one of the strange coincidences that the self-same year that I started as a student at Newcastle, which was 54. Well, a couple of coincidences, because Richard Hamilton started there the same day I did, but Lawrence Gowing also published a book on Vermeer, and I thought Vermeer was marvellous, and well, still think Vermeer is marvellous, an exquisite artist. And so for about half an hour this particular morning after I'd graduated, I tried painting like Vermeer, and then decided it really, I maybe wasn't cut out to be Vermeer. And so for another half hour, decided Van Gogh would be much easier than Vermeer. And that I soon realised Van Gogh wasn't as easy to imitate as I thought he was, and thought Soutine might be a possibility. And so went on to Soutine, and there may have been others in the chain of artists that I couldn't be, at least with 10 minutes practice. And at that time, one of the I remember I'd started a still life that was about this size, 20 by 24, one of the standard sizes that artists' canvases come. And so, in the failure to become all of those things on that canvas, I got a rag and rubbed it over. It was still wet, so it smeared the paint all over, just to even it out. And it didn't look quite right to work on, so I got some white paint. I'm not sure if it was artist gesso, I suspect. Well, probably was artist gesso. And then smeared that over the top. And it produced an interesting sort of bluish effect. And I think that has to do with the way light goes through light paint onto dark paint and then back again. And I had learnt about that effect of opalescence in technical methods at the Courtauld. Courtauld was then in a house on Portman Square, which had stables at the back. Goes back to the 18th century, and the stables were where a man called Rhys Jones gave his technical methods class, and so I knew about opalescence and recognised the effect as being appealing. And so what I did was to get some a few strips of masking tape and randomly put them over there, and then paint over more, smearing with a cloth, and it produced a different sort of opalescence. And I tore that off, and when the paint had dried, put more tape on and smeared over more, and that was really the seeds of my art making thereafter. Different aspects being taken up at different times. And so it was quickly realizing, and this I think responds somewhere in your questions there, to special events that brought about, and the special events would have to be in the first instance failing Greek, and then in the second failing within the space of one morning's practice, failing to be Vermeer, Van Gogh or Soutine, and coming therefore negatively to a process which in itself is negative, because you put on the tape and then you peel off the tape. And I think that was important to me as well, because it helps overcome the kind of self-consciousness you develop as an art historian. And it has been I think it's been enormously valuable to me, having studied art history, but it's a question of having the disadvantage of your advantages, and there are liabilities there. And I think to the extent that there is a character that goes through all my work, I think it has to do with overcoming those liabilities.
Yeah, you talk about limitations and liabilities, Eric, and I see where this is going. You actually have an interesting quote that I picked out from someplace. The quote being, I hope you'll recognize it: "All the things I value most in my art have happened for reasons I didn't intend."
Yes, and that fits precisely with that.
And that's become a light motif for you?
I think it is, and I think if we go through go through the whole of my career since graduation, there was rationalising that process that I found on that one canvas, which I still have tucked away in a crate somewhere there. I laid out strips of masking tape. At 1 inch masking tape at 1 inch intervals from each other, and thinking that must be simple enough to control, but only realizing after I'd peeled the tape off that it was impossible for me to control the direction of the masking tape. And so those, at first glance, regular patterns of checkerboards turn out to have all sorts of twists and turns, and creating all sorts of different configurations that add a kind of interest that lifts them above the level of tablecloths, and was totally unexpected, and that I never learned to control. I did try very hard to control it. I did an all-black one in deference to Ad Reinhardt, and with that I actually tried drawing pencil lines in each direction and then putting the tape on, and it didn't make any difference. They wouldn't go straight. And so there was the first thing. At first I did those on 4-foot square canvases, and worked with oil paint, either mixed with turpentine or straight out of the tube. I worked on 4-foot square canvases because I didn't want to challenge Ad Reinhardt's 5-foot square canvases. But as those were if I hadn't seen photographs of Ad Reinhardt, I think it must be a funny shape, because he says, as tall as a man, as wide as a man's outstretched arms.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, my hands will just lift something that's 5 foot square. But I'm a good few inches taller than 5 feet, and I assume he must have been as well. But it does, through him, it does mean that there is a sort of humanising connotation to the geometry And I think that's important to me as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there were those square canvases, and then I became a little dissatisfied with this kind of stippling effect that came around with that paint. And I remembered this was the experience of Rhys Jones in the stables at 20 Portman Square, that he talked about the materials that they thought the Van Eycks might have used, and that how they produced work of such jewel-like quality was that they used stand oil in the paint. Whoops, that's okay. Yes, I can actually illustrate the chemistry. This is stand oil, and it's I believe the process had something to do with leaving linseed oil out in sunlight.
Oh, as in standing.
As in standing, yeah. And the two things that, well, not just Rhys Jones, there are a whole lot of technical methods book written by a man called Laurie, who explained that it would both allow the Van Eycks to have the crispness of edges that they had, but also the smooth surface of the paint. And whereas my earliest sellotape paintings always turned out with this sort of stippled effect, once I started adding stand oil, it ran smooth. The difficulty with that, and it has to do with sunlight as well, is that in Leeds climate, it could take more than 6 weeks for the paint to dry. And eventually I did phone Winsor and Newton's to, not to complain about their paint, but to ask if there was a solution to this, and I was amazed how helpful and friendly they were. And they said that I should use one of I knew as well from my art historical studies that that the standard dryers has a Damar varnish in it, and that will go black. But when I found Winsor & Newton's, they said that a medium they produced, a gel medium called Wind Gel, had a metallic dryers that wouldn't have that negative effect. And so the revised formula for those process paintings became adding stand oil and Wind Gel medium, and occasionally a little bit of turpentine. Well, for the first coat, they'd be turpentine just painted over to be smooth, and then for the stuff that's going to go through, then to stamp on again. And of course, initially when you stamp it on, it produces that mountain range sort of effect, but then it rapidly runs smooth.
Eric, there's something that I'd like to ask you about, this question of materiality and material. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but there's a relationship here between the Courtauld Institute, the examination of art as idea, and this incredible investment in process that you've just been describing, and the materiality of art making. So I'd like to explore with you a little bit this question of the relationship between material and idea. But I'm wondering if it can be phrased through, but perhaps you would disagree, phrased through the question: what does an artist do? And I emphasize the word "do," where by virtue of using the word artist, we're actually saying you are an artist. Your being is that of an artist. And yet, and quite clearly from the way you've been talking, it's the doing that is so central to actually being an artist. I'm not sure if we can corral that into a response, but give it a try.
Yes, because what a glib response is that I think it's in my case, it's the art that makes the artist.
Mm-hmm.
That is, that I don't think, and I believe there are such people, I'm the special kind of being who has an aptitude for producing works which are producing objects which people are going to find aesthetically pleasing.
Mm.
That and I think, as I was saying, I think having studied art history made me even less of that sort of person than I was to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of clearing away all of those things which are not art in order to allow some sort of residue to come through on its own rather than through my intention. And that and I think the comparison I make is with Jackson Pollock. And I think with in my youth, the one name in art was Picasso, and there was a stage at which I think it's difficult for people to believe now, to see now, when so many other artists from that era are seem to have produced work of equal validity and equal value. In the 1940s and 50s, it didn't appear like that. Mm. Picasso seemed to have obliterated absolutely everybody. And there was one phase while I was a student where I tried producing Picasso-like works, and which did achieve some approval. But then there was Pollock, and I remember hearing of Pollock in a visiting artist presentation, talking about there being this artist in America who just threw paint at the canvas. And suddenly, in that one instant, absolutely, precisely there, I realised that art would never be the same again. And that all that time I'd spent meticulously matching colours in a row of bottles on a tiny canvas like this, that time seemed to have been completely irrelevant. And so now of course Pollock was very, very direct, dipping the paint dipping the stick or the brush or whatever it was in the canvas, and then spinning around those twirls of paint. And though it was only later that there was a psychoanalyst come art historian called Francis Valentine O'Connor, who came to give a series of lectures at Leeds while I was teaching there, and he had investigated Pollock's psychology very closely, and had even interviewed the midwife who delivered Pollock. And it was those days that kind of psychology that was supposed to go back to infancy. And in any case, it fitted in this case because Pollock was born with the umbilical cord round his neck, and if there hadn't been I forget whether it was a nurse or a doctor, it may have been a doctor present to unravel Pollock, there wouldn't have been a Pollock. And when I went back to Pollock, I saw that in fact it wasn't just drips, that the drips made these huge swirls that you could, these enveloping snake-like swirls that you could well imagining strangling somebody. And that aspect of Pollock was there, unknown and unconscious to Pollock, because it was years after Pollock's death that And I was bound to wonder, if Pollock had known that, would he have been able to go on being Pollock? It must certainly have made a difference. And so denying that consciousness, that self-consciousness, heightened by being an art historian who has to look for those things that the artist himself or herself doesn't see, then I had to try and find a way that I would do something that prevented my seeing what I was doing. And this, of course, is all rationalization after the event, but it made sense that I'd then been stripping off the masking tape and found what I'd created when I couldn't see what I was creating. And so the first works, the process paintings, my process paintings, well, there are a few of the ones more irregular at the beginning that I now call sellotape paintings, and those Trepanier-Bey have a genius for dealing with art galleries and museums, and one of those is now in the National Gallery collection, another in the Art Gallery of Ontario collection, and those I've come to regard. There are only about half a dozen of them. I come to regard those more highly than I did at the time. And then rationalising that the organisation of the tape, so that I'd work at first entirely on square canvases with the tape at intervals equal to the width of the intervals between the tape equal to the width of the tape itself. An inch tape, an inch gap, an inch tape, an inch gap, over on square 48-inch square canvases to begin with, and those would allow us as many as 4 applications without duplicating. And those worked quite well, and I wouldn't deny those, but I became dissatisfied with that the character of the paint, not at its giving it the full brilliance of its colour, and so my art historical studies told me to, and my phone call to Winsor and Newton's told me to mix it with Stand Oil, though it then produces something so sticky and slow drying. I also had to mix Wingel medium and for the base colour some turpentine as well, and that resulted in the second phase of my process paintings, which were done on panel, and 2 of those panels are immediately behind you, both in different shades of green, and then that produced a much more brilliant colour. But I found as I went on that I was looking occasionally for that optical flash that can come when you get colours to abut just right. And there was one of my fellow teachers at Leeds, John Jones, the man who had gone off to America and interviewed Ed Reinhardt and come back and told me I ought to be interested in Ed Reinhardt. And he, in his instructions to his classes, did get his students to look for that optical flash, where two bright colours are so closely matched that you can't quite relate them one way or the other, and you generate a flash. And I found that, again, this went back to studies before of the different wavelengths of light, that blue with a very short wavelength and red with a very long wavelength. And the result of that is that as you go back from these colours, the relationship between them changes. That is that as you go back from blue, because that has a shorter wavelength and gets buffeted around by whatever it encounters on the way to the eye, blue will tend to get darker at a distance, and red, for the same reason, will tend to travel more straight. And that's why along the way we have a blue sky, which is generalized light. But if there is any colour to the sun other than white, tending for the warmer colours to concentrate in the centre. And so I worked with these interacting colours, and particularly though with red and blue. As I went on, I tried matching all sorts of colours. You can see the two greens there. But eventually found myself left with either red, yellow and blue, or just red and blue. And couldn't get beyond that, and so had argued my way into a cul-de-sac, and either had to go on endlessly producing works that would match red and blue, waiting for Winsor & Newton's to come out with a brighter red and a brighter blue, but otherwise just doing exactly the same thing endlessly. Now, why I should admire Ad Reinhardt, who did do the same thing endlessly, and still think that that if it was good enough for Ad Reinhardt, it wasn't good enough for me. But I found that inhibiting and not satisfying. And then this was while I was at Guelph, and came along a man called Ian Easterbrook, who was head of audiovisual services, and who wanted to interest students in the use of television equipment. And then came along Ian Easterbrook's assistant, called Noel Harding, who suddenly, seemingly overnight, became maybe the best video artist in Canada, and then went on to become the best artist in a whole lot of other things. And maybe at this point a note of reverence and regret for Noel, who died just a few weeks ago. At Guelph, we worked together and worked very well together, though I had no misunderstanding of who was the leader in that partnership. He was an amazing artist, and he was generous enough to say that I taught him to teach, but it wasn't true. He was an incredibly good teacher as well. But came along video, and I consciously tried to apply similar principles, not having Noel Harding's sensibility. Now, there was an artist who had incredible sensibility to form the kind of patterns he could make on the surface of a screen, and the kind of sequences of form he could put together, and he knew all the time what he was doing and felt every part of it. I knew I wasn't that sort of artist, and had to look for other things, and eventually my video work came down to one piece of an hour long, which is the length of the tape, and I ran the camera, small Portapac set, so I could have the minimum exposure. What is it when you pull down the lens to aperture, the minimum aperture, and then just let it run over a model's body and pick out what it wanted to pick out. And of course I couldn't really see what was happening, and it was a difficult enough process. And then the other one was a piece of 10 seconds long, where I set up a stool between two cameras at right angles to each other, mixed the image and cut it in half, so you saw the top half of one image on top, the top half of that image on top of the bottom half of that image, and then when I ran in, jumped on the stool. As I jumped off again, my top half of my body came down first, and as I ran out, my legs followed and ran out. And then as I ran out, I inadvertently hit one of the cameras, which swung to one side, and in exasperation said, "Oh!" and then realised that the whole of that was what would make the piece, and so had to do it maybe as many as 24 times over until I got it just right. And those are my two video works, and that's my video. I made a lot of other things, but none of them are really worth mentioning.
I'm struck by something that you took quite a lot of time to consider, which is a famous remark by Clement Greenberg. And the phrase that is embodied in the remark is the one that you focused on, which is the phrase, to justify the inevitability of its particular forms. And I wonder if you would like to speak to that interest that you have.
Yes. In my the first book I wrote on these things, Bent Axis Approach, I built quite a lot of that around that particular phrase. Even though in a way I always found it perplexing because of the double, the creation of inevitability in the first place, and then the to say that that's inevitable means that it's incapable of being influenced by anything one might do one way or the other, but then justifying, meaning that after all you are still trying to, they're sort of reverse to each other. And it's a way perhaps of coming back and saying, even though I've gone to such lengths to try and eliminate that element of personal choice, yet wanting to make sure that at the end I'm doing something to accommodate them to an idea of rightness. And that sort of the judicial connotations of justify, however, still take it out of the totally personal. And it was a phrase that just jumped out at me from Clement Greenberg's text, and that seemed to me to be very significant. And I think I developed most of that first book, Bent Axis Approach, around that. And but as a way of struggling to see what it really meant, it felt right. It's funny that in the making of my art, I've gone out of my way to avoid allowing feeling directly to take over, and in the things I've written, and then coming to something that appealed to me because it felt right. So there's a peculiar sort of inversion of standard norms that leaves me in the end perplexed. And maybe that's one of the things to introduce a notion that I've that was the notion of material mysticism. You'll find in that little book, that black book with the black cover that I gave you, that in the title it says Eric Kam, a conceptual approach, and you'll see on the inside where I've crossed out the word conceptual and put material, because I think my art has come about, and I'm more comfortable with it, that I'm activating something and inducing something material to generate the art, and uncomfortable with something as direct as having produced the concept myself. And in fact there's not all that much concept to this, beyond the idea of covering an object with paint. Well, painters have been applying paint to things ever since the cave artists, so there wasn't much invention there. But
well, maybe I can come on this question of invention which in some respects is linked to the concept of originality.
Yeah.
But I don't want to necessarily dwell on originality unless you'd like to explore that, maybe through the question of invention. But I'm interested by your use of the word conviction. If originality has also, and perhaps invention, has something to do with authenticity, perhaps conviction is the word that you prefer to use.
No, you've given me the way out with the word authenticity. And that, now, what's Nelson Goodman's Languages of Art, which is from 1967, and he was a Harvard philosopher who wrote about art and wrote about notions of authenticity, saying that if you had the original Rembrandt and next to it a copy that was so perfect that nobody could tell the difference, then there'd still be the question of authenticity of the original. I'm not sure what that's got to do with my work, but it's something that struck a chord and that I think I hold on to. And well, maybe that is the part with art history as well, that beyond the appearance and everything that can be adduced from the appearance, there is the fact of what the work is. And well, those aspects of English philosophy that developed around Bertrand Russell, who in his history of Western philosophy ends with those notions of fact, a philosophy of fact. I think that has had a lot of bearing on the way I've come to look at things. And of course, being an art historian as well, you look for the facts. And there is the fact of what the things are, as well as the fact of the aesthetic that they present. So authenticity hovers somewhere between those two, and in that sense, it is significant to me.
Just to quote a single end to one of your sentences, actually, in Pentaxis, you talk about uncovering the planes on which a painting or a sculpture perhaps could operate, and hence open up the possibilities of re-establishing a hierarchy of values that may claim to be the intrinsic values of art, and not merely, and I like this part, and not merely the incidental values of some dubious social or psychological good.
Yes. Oh, no, that is something that and the middle ground in there is the way Clement Greenberg talks about the area of competence, and he's talking about the area of competence of materials and of the media of the different arts. But then in my own thinking, I've extended that to the area of competence of the person, the maker, and I've that being trained to be an artist doesn't give you the competence to mouth off on politics or social issues or anything else. And I've at one time I think I wrote that I wouldn't want to live in a world that had been saved by any of the artists I know. That may even be in that same text.
Can I ask you, Eric? Do you think that there's a zeitgeist or a major or overwhelming discourse that you find operating currently, or has been operating during the currency of your work?
If there has been in art since the 60s, I think the 60s was the 60s is the period of my anchorage, through Ad Reinhardt, through minimalism. Minimalism much more than conceptualism. Then there has progressively been a shift towards the social and the political, and I'm out of sympathy with all of it. And it does hinge on that issue of competence, and particularly as there are other things that, I think for the people who set art on a social or political basis, they're thinking of setting art on something which is ungrounding art in a way. But it seems to me that that's something which is secondary, which changes from age to age, and that comes up out of the material biological basis of the material world and the biological species that we are. And that to have an anchorage in the behaviour of matter itself is in fact a ground art in something which is much more fundamental in relation to reality, and which yet, because it is the business of the artist to learn to cope with material things, is something which does grow out of the competence of the artist. And so it's not a retreat for me, but a probing more deeply that brings me to and I think there is, the organic form that these seem to take, these objects seem to take, and that all my work seems to take, which on some level or another is going to be borrowing from my biological, psychological basis as an entity, that those transfer themselves to the work by a process which I recognise but don't understand and can't explain in detail, and that does result in there being, Ernst Gombrich's term was that art is an activity by human beings for human beings, and I don't think even when I've gone, when I've set myself apart from things that seem to me to be wrong-headed in relation to that I've ever lost the underlying awareness that art in the end has to be an activity for human beings as well as by human beings.
You've written a fascinating analysis of Aristotle's Poetics, and I wonder if you could summarize or come back to that discussion.
I think it. Well, the Poetics is a very complex text, but the thing that I took out of it was the notion of inevitability, and and disentangling the word to mean unavoidableness, and which is fundamental to my way of working, that at each stage it's been avoiding communicating directly a meaning, and yet at the same time hoping that my art wasn't just going to be pattern making, and drawing a distinction between intended meaning and imprinted meaning, and hope that that if I think there is necessarily something limited in the extent that we can understand and encompass the world around us, but that what we are and the way we interact with the environment can imply so very much more, and in a way just hoping through all the things I've done that that some such meaningfulness is going to emerge and be apparent to other people, even if I can't always see it myself.
Then I'm going to phrase one last question around the connection between teaching and writing. And if criticism hasn't been of specific interest to you, I am interested in the degree to which teaching, and of course you've also spent a lifetime writing, how these circulate in your practice.
Yes, well, all of my 99.9% of my wherewithal has come from teaching, and so I owe it a good deal of respect. And it came up in a discussion in the university a while ago, somebody asking an interviewee for a job position about how they maintain a relationship between their art and their teaching. And I had to come in at that time and said, I've made a conscious point of trying to keep the two as far apart as possible. And that is because and teaching and criticism are alike to that extent, in that you're trying to make conscious things that may not have been conscious for others. And I do that, and I believe in that. But I also believe that for me, I have to keep all that at a distance from my art making, and so that they. I remember Jerry Ferguson, for whom those people at NASCAD I have great respect for, Gary Kennedy, Jerry Ferguson, and other people that I worked with. And I remember Jerry Ferguson speaking scornfully about artists who teach their students how to make the artist's art, and being very disdainful of that. And that struck a chord with me, and I thought Jerry was right on that, as well as a great many other things. I tried to keep them as separate as possible, and I think out of respect for students, I don't want. I don't think I have had any students who've simply imitated my art, and if it did happen, I'd go everything I could to discourage it. And for their sake, not for as much as for mine. Can you see inside there? And can you see the streaks of grey and white, which appear to be alternating coats of grey and white, but in fact there are far more coats of paint than there are those. It's just an occasional one that comes through. There are actually 2,116 half coats of paint on this piece. On the next one along, it's 1,116, and on this last one, the little one that you've got in your hand, there are just 16. And so you see, all of them started off with a canister of film. But I think we came across it that in my art I've tried to avoid intended meaning, but hoping that in the process of my being in the world and those things being in the world, some kind of transference, implanting of meaning would take place, so they become more than decorative objects.
I think you succeeded.